to wonder whether we could start to kind of latch on to the different kind of games we play at different times of our life with these different types of formation. And with these types of gaming practices, we might then also, when we're younger and as children, start to reflect on who we want to become, the sense of self we develop as we move through our lives. Who do we want to become? Who are we kind of aspire to be like? Who are we afraid of becoming, and so on. So I've used the theory of possible selves to start articulating a sense of how gaming might start framing a sense of future kind of biography for us when we're younger. And there's all sorts of things to talk about here. I'm not going to go through all this now because I'm aware that I don't want to bore anyone, especially after amazing videos and fantastic talks from other colleagues. But what I want to kind of reflect on with gaming and youth is the kind of importance of the different ways in which our youth identity can be framed. When we look at youth identity, we look at all sorts of things more broadly, things like school, institutional settings. We look at our peer groups, the structure of our peer groups. We look at our symbolic and sort of boundaries, so our subcultures and so on. We might look at meanings and practices that are kind of independent from our parent cultures and mainstream cultures. So a lot of great work in the 70s looked at that. We might look at generational transformations in the life course. We might look at the history of the economy and big kind of massive kind of societal changes and so on. And the thing is, once I started reflecting on all these things, as I tend to do in the work I do generally, I started to realize that modern gaming can accommodate all these different stages. It can accommodate our notions of institutional setting. It can accommodate our sense of peer group inclusion. It can accommodate the symbolic kind of boundaries that we use to separate ourselves from other groups and so on. And it started to reflect on how modern gaming can basically be this way of understanding youth identity in different ways. So with this in mind, I kind of really was influenced heavily by the rise of the kind of bio game. And this touched on Adam's talk before, which I thought was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Adam. And he talked about fantastic games like That Giant Cancer, and I'm a big fan of these games. These games really influenced me in reflection of this work, because I think, similar to Adam, I kind of think there's an importance in understanding reflexive modes of gaming in terms of reflecting on how the games we play might influence who we are and who we might become. Games like What Remains of Edith Finch, the most recent Unpacking game, if anyone played that, it's fantastic. Unpacking is great. You get to basically play the game, a story and a narrative through unpacking different items in someone's life in their room, and you get a sense of how they've grown through that. It's a lovely, beautiful game. And really, there's a question, I think, with these experiences of people using games in more reflexive ways to talk about the kind of parts of our life which games maybe haven't always been able to talk about. And I think that's quite important to do so. So this is the other part of this I wanted to reflect on. This is very much, I mean, the first kind of basis of this was playing What Remains of Edith Finch, which I will talk about a bit later. But it's a really important game, I think, for these types of experiences. So I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy VII. I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy VII in the context of me a little bit as well, if you don't mind. So 1997, I was 12 years old. I was, I'm 34 now, 12 years old then, which makes me very old, or feels very old. And I loved this game. It was an important aspect of my life, and it was an important game more broadly speaking. For those who might not be aware, FF7 is quite a significant JRPG. It was one of the first games that kind of popularized a genre around the world. Although not the first kind of big JRPG or not the best, there were fantastic games in that genre going all the way through the 80s and 90s, but it was quite culturally significant in that it kind of broke through in different kind of markets around the world. And that was really quite important for this particular genre of game. It was very, very popular. I think it sold 17 to 20 million units since. It had massive cultural impact. It's been written about an awful lot. I don't know if I need to explain FF7 to anyone, but if you haven't played it, I would recommend you do so. It's lovely. It had a kind of focus on a kind of like inclusive narrative, which I really enjoyed. And I think that's what I'm going to talk about a bit in a moment in terms of influence on me. One of the things I'd say about it, and one of the things I think about when we reflect on games that we played when we were younger, is we've got to think about the context of us at that time, who we were, and why that game had that influence on us at that point when it did. As I said before, I was 11 or 12 years old. I played this game. I adored it. You know, and I wasn't someone who I think was, you know, I never played anything like this before. Like this game actually told a story which really had an impact on me. FF7, I won't go through any spoilers. I was just worried or not. I don't want to ruin the game for everyone who played it, but it's got a fantastic kind of narratives of quite deep kind of themes around kind of sense of self and identity and stigma. And again, these types of things had a major influence on me as the academic at the game. I started thinking about this stuff through this experience, I think, at this point, or at least it opened it up, I think. Things like grief, gender identities, mental health, eco-politics, colonization, corporate social harms, the kind of environmental destruction. The game covers all these things. And for 11 or 12 years old, you know, I didn't understand all of it, if I'm honest. I was a little bit maybe new to figuring out those kind of more complex things, but it certainly opened up those questions around fairness and inclusivity. And it really, you know, did that in a way for me, which I don't think anything else did. Nothing, no other form of media opened that up or had that influence. And the other thing to say about this, of course, I guess, is more deeply is how important are these experiences? Do such episodic memories, you know, make us reflect on aspects of our youth identity formation? Did these experiences influence my own sense of self, my politics, even my research? I'm teaching focused now. You know, what was that game for you? You know, what was that game that made you kind of reflect on those things, or wasn't there one? I don't know. I think that's quite interesting. So sociologists like to reflect on something like this, where they start to think, well, how do we start kind of framing these experiences? And what we've looked at is a researcher, a social theorist called I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Halbox. So sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And the particular argument that Halbox made in his work was that collective experience can shape a collective form of memory. A kind of subculture can be kind of memorialized through these experiences. And in gaming, this is quite fascinating because often that's kind of technologically determined. It's based on a kind of console space or a certain type of thing that played that. And it means that groups have collective memories of that particular experience and that particular group they joined in with. And in a way, what I want to reflect on here is what extent did historically big important games like FF7 carry this collective memory? Did they carry this cultural capital? And really, in the modern context, what does it mean when you get this kind of modern corporations that attempt to own or even gatekeep these memories attached to gaming? We can see this when a modern game comes out and there's a kind of tension or conflict in how that game has been received with a fan base that wanted a different type of experience, for instance. You know, there's a kind of importance to safeguard that nostalgia and try to encourage what that is, whilst at the same time pushing the game on to something where it should be, you know, to make sure that game is the way it should be, as it were. So forward to 2020, in 2015, the FF7 remake is announced, and it's incredibly exciting because, you know, for me and my family, my younger brother played this game as well. We were like, this is the best thing ever. The particular kind of gaming landscape had changed massively, of course, at this point. As we all know, we had a huge growth in community subcultures around FF7. There's a rise of fan culture around the world, and quite well, and very positively, we have much more open and represented communities, although still too many groups excluded. And one of the things which I noticed when I compare the experience of 97 to 2020 is the way in which gaming has shifted was really reflected in the way in which you could see this growth of subculture, that remembering what that experience was in 1997. This is a YouTuber called Maximilian Dude. He's great. And he's a huge FF7 fan. And one of the things which this video particularly shows, if you click on it, I don't think I've got the link on here, but I'll send it to anyone. This is when it was announced, and the actual kind of notion of people like Max kind of influencing FF7 is now much more important. That fan community, or the same fan community that have almost kind of become what the game is in its modern era, which I think is quite interesting. So when I started to compare these two things a little bit, and this is something which I need to reflect on a bit more, like I started to think, well, what was the 97 experience? It had all these great influences on me. And when I played the modern one, as much as I enjoyed it, I didn't feel the same kind of thing. It just felt a bit different, I suppose. And I started to wonder whether there was this intersection or a conflict, perhaps, a tension potentially between different types of fandom that's mediated by the life course, by our memories of games, you know. And that made me reflect on how subcultures might change and how valid the concept is now, and question that, you know, as we see gaming kind of broaden and we see a shifting in how these communities kind of are formed, there might be a loosening of the symbolic boundaries that once defined these cultures that we're part of when we were younger. And that might create a kind of resistant nostalgia, I think, in many, many ways. And really, what I wanted to argue with this is that, and it's a new piece of work, so there's a lot to do yet. We need to figure out some of the theory behind it, but is reframing how we look at gaming a little bit. We know video games are crucial in developing a standard modern world. That's really important. We know that. Yeah, there's an importance to also reflect on our own historical biographical approaches and how games have influenced and shaped those things. I think by doing so, it allows us to historically map the kind of groups that have been included and excluded through gaming, and hopefully make those things much better in future. But there's also a kind of practical kind of analysis of this. If we can understand these more biographical, long forms of gaming, reflect on the historical dimensions of gaming, we can start looking at things in a more longer form. So rather than kind of being kind of like thinking, okay, here's a new development, we start positioning that in terms of what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Is this a new thing, or is it kind of a dominant, or is it a new form of new thing? The most recent example of this is NFTs. You know, NFTs are becoming quite discussed in all sorts of contexts now. Yeah, we could see that as part of a much deeper neoliberal kind of problem around how gaming spaces are utilized as neoliberal case studies for forms of NFT or DRM or whatever else we're looking at. So this historical analysis is really important. It allows us to reflect on the cultural meaning of video games, and that's kind of what I'm arguing. Maybe by comparing an old game like 1997 5 7 and with a new one, we can start reflecting on what that kind of means.